1 2 testing 1 2 1 2 testing 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 4 1 2 1 2 3 4 5 6.
Hi, good morning. Can anybody hear me?
Hi, Nikki. Yes, we can. We're about to get started. Thank you. Thank you. Morning, everybody. How are you? For those that don't know, I'm Zen Mate, and help coordinate the civil society working group on state capture. In the interest of time, it would be great if we could kick off with I'll pass the mic around with a round of introductions so we can all get a sense of who's in the room, as we always do when we start our meetings. Just name an organization, and then I'll run through our program and ask anybody in the room if there's any adjustments or if we're in agreement, and then I'll hand over to our opening address from Nikki Prince. But yeah, thank you.
Good morning, Lawson Naidu from CASAC.
Hi, Mary Hawthorne from NRC.
Good morning, Mbegezeli Benjamin from Judges Matter.
Hi everyone, Chris Fisher from the Helen Suzman Foundation.
Hi, morning everyone. Mike Marchant from Open Secrets.
Morning everyone, Mutlatiko Monte from Corruption Watch.
Hi, morning everyone. Robin from My Vote Counts.
Good morning, everyone. Litlakonolo from Open Secrets.
Hi, everyone. Ariella Sher from the Center for Applied Legal Studies.
Hi, everyone. Anis Dera from the Center for Applied Legal Studies.
Morning, everyone. Tabiso Padrenyatwa from Perry.
Morning, my name is Devi. I'm from the Public Affairs Research Institute, Perry.
Morning, everyone. Nikki Van Treat from Corruption Watch.
Morning, Moira Campbell from Corruption Watch.
Morning, Sasha Stevenson from Section 27.
Morning, Lilita Twabe from Workers' World.
Morning, Takatso Pongweni from Daily Maverick.
Greetings to everyone. My name is Simon Ramapoputla from Workers' World Media Production.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. So yes, welcome to our in-person CSWG meeting. This is not the first meeting we've had this year, but it's the first in-person meeting we've had for, I think, a very long time. We've been meeting online, especially after COVID. We adapted our model. We started off meeting in Section 27's boardroom back in 2008, and so we're kind of come full circle, it seems, to back where it all began. A lot of the same organizations were in the room, but not a lot of the same people were in the room from those organizations. So it's exciting to see that the commitment to this process continues beyond the individuals and filters through to the organizational level. So just to run through the program, thanks everybody for being here. We'll be starting with our opening address from Nikki Prince, who some of you may or may not know was the civil society liaison in the Zondo Commission, and was in many ways our point person as civil society, as we engaged with the commission over the years that it ran. And I think since Nikki will give us a background of where life is after the commission and our role for civil society in this election year and post the commission. And after that, we will go to the collective civil society response, which is in front of everybody. And we'll have inputs from everybody that has been part of the subgroup drafting committee. And I'll introduce everybody to those people that have helped to drive this process along. And we'll have input and we'll have questions and discussions after that from the room. And we'll then break for refreshments, and we'll excuse our media colleagues, both in person and online, after that, and we'll go into a closed CSWG group session where we engage on what does it look like for us to be collaborating on this work in an election year. Letlokonolo will lead us on some of the progress we've been making on the Zondo tracker, and we'll use that as a space for us to workshop some ideas around what our feedback is on how it's looking at the moment, and what are the ways we can adapt and change, and how we're wanting that to look when we do launch it, and talking around what that launch might look like a couple of months from now. And we'll be getting some feedback from our colleagues that are working more closely with elections, from My Vote Counts, and possibly Defend Our Democracy, who will then seed our discussion on election year and what our engagement on this as civil society looks like. And then we will be looking at what our work as the CSWG going forward looks like, what's on the horizon, and our immediate next steps, with a proviso that will include us discussing our engagement with Parliament on some of this, with some feedback on what's been happening internally, and for us to engage on what that means for us. And we'll close with some lunch, and we'll go have a good afternoon thereafter. So thanks everybody, and we will be keeping track of time. We'll try our best to make sure that we're still finishing off at 2. I know we do this work with everything on the go, and so it's great that everybody's here, and so we want to respect that time. But yeah, thanks everyone. I think I'm going to hand over to Nikki now for the opening address.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Just checking that you can all see me okay.
Yes. Sorry.
Fantastic. Okay, so lovely to have this opportunity to talk to all of you today. There's one or two of you in the audience that I know, and wonderful to connect with you again after the many years we spent fighting state capture under the Zuma administration. But for those who don't know much about me, I'll just give you a brief description of my background, and this will help to inform you where I'm coming from and give background to the theme of my talk this morning, which is the need for civil society to remain vigilant against the danger of a return to state capture. So on my background, I spent many years as a country risk analyst, about 10 years doing that. And after that, I was a senior official in the National Treasury for 9 years. I ran a unit which spent a good time fighting the nuclear build deal, that's infamously known, and was being pursued by President Jacob Zuma, as well as a number of other big projects. And that experience brought me in close contact with the state-owned entities and the peculiar problems they started experiencing in the 2010s as they became the target of the Gupta family. Although we didn't know at first what exactly it was that was happening, and it took some time to figure out what was behind it all. The National Treasury, as many of you know, also became a target during this time, and the impact was felt on many of us officials working there, especially those working closely with the leadership and any project or entity that the Zuma and Gupta nexus had taken an interest in. As state capture was heating up end of 26 and into 2017, I left the Treasury. I went to work full-time doing research analysis and exposing what was going on with state capture. I joined the ranks of a number of the country's academics and civil society organizations and investigative journalists. In particular, I participated in the State Capacity Research Group, some of which are presented here today, such as Parry. And we worked to try and conceptualize what this phenomenon was that the country was experiencing, and to produce a report that some of you may know, which is The Betrayal of the Promise, which got released in 2017 and was followed by the book Shadow State the following year. And at the time, also worked on reference works for WWF on the nuclear build program, and we were looking to understand how civil society could help strategize against it, and how what were the forces that were pushing it from within government, and what were their strategies. And then at the same time, also as part of the State Capacity Research Group, I helped support the development of a reference material on ESCOM, which resulted in a booklet being produced number of reports on the findings of the Commission. I was part of a skeleton team that worked until the very end with perpetrators, right until the final reports were published. So with that, with the State Capture Commission done, I left to begin work on my own book about fighting state capture, which I finished the first draft, and I'm busy working on my second draft on the book. And at the same time, I've been developing a project that I had been conceptualizing for many years, which is an early warning system for detecting the presence and spread of state capture across state entities. So these two main focuses of mine are at an advanced stage, and I'm working with partners to bring those both to life. So as I continue my work on state capture and the subject of fighting it, I'm daily reminded of the need for there to be a vibrant, active and committed civil society to fight state capture. You know, the state capture under the Gupta-Zuma nexus, which I'll call it State Capture 1.0, it had its agenda interrupted and its leadership mostly removed after a momentous multi-pronged campaign by many actors in society. And that included foremostly civil servants, many activists, opposition politicians, investigative journalists, very importantly civil society organizations. And people work together with great purpose and determination and a lot of courage at a time because they wanted to fight for their country and for democracy. And it was a time when nothing was certain and we had very few resources, especially compared to those who were up against, who had the resources of the South African state in their command. And yet it was done. And South Africa is one of the few examples globally of having fought off a corrupt regime that wishes to see the state entirely captured and its democratic institutions undone. It doesn't mean that everything's perfect, or that all examples of corruption or state capture, as we'll discuss in a minute, are completely done away with. But what was achieved is something to be proud of. There are many countries that wish that they could do what we have already achieved in South Africa, and there are many lessons for the rest of the world, and still for ourselves going forward in that effort. So as I've said, we are still not done, and we're not done with State Capture 1.0. Law enforcement, as you all know, itself is captured, it had its capacity weakened, and it's in the process of having to rebuild itself now, while also pursuing the very complex and unique cases of state capture that took place. Those wheels are turning, but slowly, and there are at least civil cases being brought against those that are implicated that are more advanced, whilst a number of them have also been criminally charged. They also face many other consequences, such as losing their professional registration, disciplinaries, being fired, having to leave their positions, and having very critically lost their reputations. And it's not so much them that I would, a lot of those who are implicated that I would be worried about at this stage, because a lot of them are tied up in dealing with just those consequences. But the fact that there haven't been convictions and sentences is more of a problem in that there's no definite lesson to the rest of society that crime doesn't pay in South Africa. And so impunity still prevails. And we only have to look around us to see that there are continued examples of corruption. And even through the State Capture 1.0 period, aside from the state capture, there were many unrelated cases of corruption. That corruption was pervasive, and even before state capture, helped to create the fertile ground which then enabled it. And one could argue, as many others have, that there were isolated or local cases of, localized cases of state capture happening in the state. So that could be at a there were other syndicates also at work seeking to capture those organizations, control their decision making, make their agendas their own private agenda, forcing the staff in those entities either to follow that agenda or leave, and overriding their professional requirements and the mandates of those organizations, and then ultimately using the powers and the resources that they grabbed in those organizations for whatever their own ends were, which could be securing repeated financial benefits from a series of corrupt acts, or using those resources to just stay in power, whether at that entity or in a particular political sphere in which they're active. And leaving, if we look into the post-Zuma era, there are a lot of examples of major corruption which have been unearthed, such as the procurement of PPE by the health departments during the COVID pandemic, and that was a shock at how quickly it came, especially during the very Zondo Commission. There have been more revelations that came out in ESCOM and PRASA. We've recently seen the announcement of a Treasury-led investigation into the IDT. There have been questions around regional growth funds and housing departments and very serious nature of their spending, the misuse of the National Lottery, and then even more serious cases on what is going on at SANRAL, NASFAS, PetroSA, and SEF, which speak to possible systemic cases of corruption. And this is not to say that in the state there are no turnarounds happening. It is very pleasing to see examples, especially I think the leading light is that of SARS under its Commissioner Edward Kieswetter, who recently had his term extended for another 2 years. But we have to ask, are we in a position to say that we feel confident that our departments and state-owned entities, our DFIs, the large projects and procurements in the country, or never mind any other size of procurement, is no longer a target for state capture and corruption? If we just look at one industry as an example, how confident are we feeling that with the new nuclear tender, even though it is meant to be on a less ambitious scale than what was proposed before, how confident do we feel with that being put out to procurement? Or what about the massive electricity transmission bills, which is valued in the hundreds of billions and must happen in the next decade or two? Will that be safe? The plan for the industrial scale rollout of gas infrastructure, future rounds of the renewable energy programs, all of these things create an energy space which is highly lucrative. Hundreds of billions, as I mentioned, will get spent on contracts, and this will attract a great many players and their attention. And so we have to ask ourselves, do we trust the current gatekeepers of energy and of the procurements to safeguard this very space? And so the problem in my thinking is, especially when we look at the post-Zuma era, is that I don't think, looking back on state capture, that it was limited to being just a Zuma or an ANC problem, even though certainly both have been deeply problematic. But we need to understand whether the problem is more pervasive than either of these parties. In other words, if a different political party or set of parties was to be in charge tomorrow after May 2024, what's the likelihood that they would also bring state capture and systemic corruption into their regime? Now, Francis Fukuyama, in his study of the historical development of political institutions, gave some very interesting perspectives on the problem of political patronage. And he suggested that patronage is among the most basic forms of human relations, because there is an innate human tendency towards nepotism and reciprocal altruism, where we naturally favor our own and we want to keep benefiting them and them us. So the question, he says, is is not why in a country's development that pervasive patronage exists, but why, in fact, that it becomes possible to ever develop modern political systems that can resist these tendencies. And he goes on to say that change is difficult and political classes will resist the existential threat to their interests if you try to unroot that patronage. And what was interesting is what he finds was the pivotal factor in moving a society towards modern political institutions. And that pivotal factor, he found, was a development of a professional civil service, one that is built on the principles of impersonality and meritocracy, and where those principles are central to the design and operation of its institutions, most importantly including recruitment and policy making, and where the rule of the law has to apply to everyone, with no one, especially the political leadership, above the law. There has to be separation as much as possible between politics and the administration. And so just as I'm saying that, I'm sure a lot of you thinking, well, there already lies a lot of difficulty for South Africa. As in many countries, where outwardly you can be a modern democratic state, but inwardly under huge pressure from political patronage, and where the principle of public interest is routinely being undermined by loyalty to the interests of a party or a faction of it, or whatever vested interests have pervaded it. And that the policy of cater deployment can be defended at this time in South Africa, when it was so obviously central to the modus operandi of state capture in the Zuma administration, is deeply troubling. It really questions how far we have moved on. It is profoundly disappointing, and it is delusional. The lessons were very clear in what happened at our public institutions, from Eskom to Transnet, Prasa, Denel, SAA, Alexcor, the SABC, the Department of Mineral Resources, just to name some of them. People were parachuted into board and executive positions with the expectation of serving a particular agenda in return. There's been a lot of public debate on this, rightfully so. A lot of that debate that I've seen apportions lack of merit as the problem, as the key problem with cadre deployment. And I would agree that in many cases this is clearly a problem, with some very inappropriate, unqualified candidates being appointed who did great damage with their ill-conceived actions in our public institutions. But I would argue that the bigger problem is really one of intentions. In many instances in state capture, individuals who were irregularly placed into high-level positions were well-qualified, experienced, and very smart individuals. And they wielded this towards devastating results as they helped pursue a corrupt agenda, the agendas they were sent with. So normalizing and condoning cadre deployment will provide a hugely enabling platform in South Africa, on which the forces of corruption and state capture will just continue to make their inroads into the South African state. It is something that is highly, highly vulnerable to abuse, and it is inconceivable that in our current stage of political development, in our current political context, that such a practice would result in anything other than systemic corruption. It is inconceivable that that system would result in an outcome that is corruption-free. It is unconstitutional, in addition, in the very least, to endorse the pre-choosing of candidates in this way, something that was spoken about at length in the final Zondo reports, and which Chief Justice Raymond Zondo was very clear about. And I would argue that there are factors that continue to make South Africa fertile ground to state capture 2.0, for the following reasons. We are very young democracies and our political institutions are still in a fledgling state. Plus, we're a highly unequal society. We are battling to get beyond that. We have a substantial extractive economy, which also lends itself to all forms of extortion. And it's also an economy that is struggling to industrialize to sufficiently create mass job opportunities. On top of that, economic times are harder given the impact of repeated global crises from COVID to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, localized impacts of major floods such as in Durban, and notwithstanding the massive impact of the July 2021 insurrection in the country that cost an estimated 50 billion. And with our country still lacking a strong entrepreneurial capitalist class, or of a sufficiently enabling environment to give would-be opportunities an opportunity, we will continue to have a significant tenderpreneur problem. The state, thus, is still seen as the road to access resources and social mobility by many. Against this, the rule of law in the country is still weak because we are rebuilding our law enforcement institutions, and it is turning out to be a longer-term project than originally envisioned. It is not clear at the same time that democratic accountability is substantially improved under the Ramaphosa administration. We need to ask ourselves if Parliament is yet doing a significantly better job to hold the administration to account on their performance. It is also questionable whether the ANC has really renewed itself as it has promised. We do see improvements and we do see examples of committees being set up, looking for more ethical reviews of people's behavior and the jettisoning of a few problematic individuals, but there are many others in its ranks that remain problematic, implicated individuals, and who are still deployed to senior positions and positions where they have power over resources and decision making. The other thing to bear in mind that makes us vulnerable as a country is that there hasn't been a lot of investment in major nation building since the years of the democratic transition. Nation building really relies on events such as sports and cultural achievements that are left to generate a sense of common South African identity. But that feeling only lasts as these events are able to capture the public imagination. And lastly, I think that the last 10 or 20 years have done a lot of damage and left us with a low level of trust in society, where many people feel that the system just does not work for them, and that getting ahead requires cheating and subverting the system. The reforms that are needed to drive a systemic pushback on the levels of corruption are slow in coming, and in some cases not that well crafted. It is important that South Africa has an anti-corruption body, that we have stronger and clearer procurement rules, proper whistleblower support, a better appointment mechanism for boards and senior executives that has a significant degree of independence from politicians. We need law enforcement operations that are independent and well capacitated, and a civil service that is professionalized and its operations insulated as much as possible from political interference. The other, I think, problematic factor that we need to bear in mind is that the way in which we experience state capture 2.0 may not be the same as what went before. Because the political and criminal world, globally and locally, is constantly changing, and we need to keep our sights on this. The ANC is losing its majority, but it has splintered and spawned offshoots with various levels of commitment to the norms of democratic institutions. That President Jacob Zuma feels no compunction in heading a new political party that seeks to compete in the polls regardless of all that has gone before that is associated with his name and his time in power. And despite all the revelations of the State Capture Commission and an insurrection that followed, that were connected to his arrest is deeply concerning. Also, the style of Zuma and the NK party also appears to be communicating something about the set of values that they hold and how they will behave if they are given power. The militarization of politics, revolutionary promises that are not necessarily democratic, feudal values and policies, belief in conspiracies, and alignment with various notorious parties. So we have to ask ourselves what sort of predatory agenda will be unleashed on the state should this kind of party prevail. Global and local trends in the criminal world also show that we need to be very careful of the potential nexus that can be formed with our local politics if our political culture is allowed to stagnate into one that is regressive and predatory in nature. There is currently significant momentum behind money laundering syndicates, drug smuggling networks, that even sophisticated European cities who are well-resourced are battling to dislodge. The proliferation of mafias in a number of countries and of extortion economies in countries that are experiencing democratic backsliding. There is good news in the ramping up of governmental, international, and academic efforts to fight and stymie these forces, but it is a long-term process to get these to where collectively they pose a systemic level of impact. And so for South Africa, perhaps the ancient Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu would say to us, if you do not change direction, you may end up where you are headed. None of this is meant actually to paint a picture of doom and gloom, and I'm personally not a pessimist, but it is only to point to the various risks and vulnerabilities and to argue why civil society cannot afford to rest, and it is critically important for it to keep acting to ensure South Africa's democratic future. During the fight back against state capture under Zuma, civil society provided and proved that it is courageous, it is creative and resourceful, and it is able to operate in the face of incredible uncertainty. It also showed what a small number of people can do when committed and organized. Their ability to diagnose, to expose, inform, campaign, and lead society when leaders were needed, mobilized the country in a very impressive way. And as I mentioned earlier, the country's fight back has been quoted by many internationally as an example of what can be done in the face of a regime which wishes to dismantle that democracy. I've made an argument that for various reasons, South Africa's political institutions are at a vulnerable moment in their development. Civil society organizations need to remain organized and coordinated, partnering with each other to push for reforms, holding government to account, monitoring what is going on and challenging what is happening in institutions with their big projects and their programs, to challenge society to be curious and to shine the economic light, for citizens to take note and take action, to support whistleblowers, to help report bad behavior in government, and keep campaigning on issues and keeping the pressure on government. So I'm going to end with a famous saying whose origins has been lost somewhat in time, but I think is appropriate to repeat here, which is never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Nikki, for that input. And I was going to open to the room for some questions, but in the interest of time, if there's nothing burning, I'll say thank you, Nikki, and we'll continue.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Following Nikki's address, and I think we are just only 5 minutes behind schedule now. So hopefully, yeah, we're working well to maintain time. We're going to move into our internal conversation and presentation on the civil society working groups, collective response to the Zondo Commission and the state capture report. And my colleagues and subgroup drafting team will be making some inputs here. Ariella from Culls, Devi from Parry, and Mutlati from Corruption Watch. And so before I hand over, just as a bit of background to how we got here to this point, to launching this collective civil society response, and a little bit of an overview of what's in it. So for those that don't know, the Civil Society Working Group on State Capture first met here in 2018. Sorry, not 2008, 2018. And it was actually following, there were a couple things on the go at that time. There had been the release of the State of Capture report by the public protector Thuli Madonsela, and there was the Gupta leaks and the organization of the journalists and the media in that process, and civil society coming together in that moment and speaking out and uncovering state capture and corruption. And what followed was then the Zondo Commission, and the sense was from civil society that they were handing over the baton now to a commission that's going to take this work forward. I think Parry had also had a conference shortly the establishment of the commission in a moment called After Capture. And then there was a little bit of debate within civil society. Is there such a thing as after capture? And I think Nikki's linking, I'll connect that to the end, on Nikki's concept of this fertile ground for state capture 2.0. And we came together following that conference in this very room with the organizations that have continued to be part of this and have formed the Civil Society Working Group on State Capture, and to say this shouldn't really be a moment where civil society pulls back. We're a country of commissions, for better or for worse. And our history with that is not necessarily a very good one. With the Sariti Commission being a chief example of that, where the commission was used there to cover up corruption in the arms deal, and was essentially a tool to continue to push the narrative of the fact that there was no corruption in the arms deal. And so there was this recognition within civil society that given our history as a country of commissions, and given this moment, it's not, let's support the work of the commission in the best way that we can, but also let's try and remain critical of the commission. And at that point, we weren't sure if the commission was going to be operating in good faith and pushing the work forward in that way. And one of the ways we committed to do that was to not just come around, and yes, conversations are important in the meeting of minds, and dialogue and discussion is, and so not to take away from that, but to say what are the practical things that we can be doing as this coalition to continue, if this is our mandate, to push this work forward. And what came from that was submissions made by civil society organizations within the Civil Society Working Group to the Commission, linked to areas of work that civil society organizations were already engaged in. And so these submissions were made. I think we made over about 15 submissions to the Commission over in the beginning of its process, and we engaged the Commission to say, here are evidence-based and fact-based submissions on the effects of state capture and corruption, and what is actually happening in the different areas of work that we occupy. And following that, the Civil Society Working Group continued to be engaged in a number of things. Shortly was the people's hearing on state capture. There was the feeling that, you know, the Commission isn't bringing into the conversation the cost and the human cost of state capture and corruption. And it's important for us to try and to do that. And the Civil Society Working Group hosted the People's Hearing on State Capture in 2019. And we submitted those findings to the Zondo Commission in addition to what was then an agenda for action, a submission we also made, and a report that is available, that pulled together all the submissions made to the Zondo Commission and to say, here is a one-stop shop of what we've been saying and submitting to you. And in that we included the findings from the people's hearing on state capture. And so following that, there was COVID, the work of the commission kind of reached a lull. The Civil Society Working Group wrote to the commission to say, why have the hearings not resumed? What is happening? Can you give us an update? And shortly thereafter, the commission responded with a press conference and a response to us to say, yes, they're in the process of trying to get things back up and running, and our hearings commenced online thereafter. And after that, the Civil Society Working Group released a key witness list, 101 key witnesses, to say, the commission's work has been going on, a number of extensions have been happening, there are some key people and companies that haven't been earmarked or called to the commission. Why is that the case? These are the people that we think, and the companies we think, based on our evidence-based submissions and the work that we've been doing, should be called by the Zondo Commission. And following that, we've had a moment here now where we've said, after the life of the commission, now that the commission's work has come to an end, what is our response to that process, and what is our response in the next steps? And so the collective civil society response on the Zondo Commission and State Capture report was born from that. And it stands as a continued, long, active space to say, we're here and we're watching what happens. I think for us, we know this was an important moment, and what happens after commissions often is that a lot of their work is relegated to the margins or kind of disappears. And we're saying that this is not a moment for that to happen. And in this report, really, we start on the reflections on the commission and the roles of commissions in our society and what that means, and our role as civil society in relation to that. And then we go into what are the things that the Zondo Commission did well, and where are the areas that it really, as the working group and as the organizations here, we feel they missed the mark. And we move into what are the lessons we feel as the organizations in this working group can be learned from the work of the Zondo Commission. And then we move into what are the key areas that we feel we should be tracking in terms of the implementation of the Zondo Commission. And the final reflections are really moving into what now, and what role, beyond institutional reform, what is the role for creative and civil society and public engagement around bringing about change. And I'll bring us back into a close of this, but I'll hand over to Ariella to kick us off on her inputs. I'll just have to.
Thanks so much, Zen. I won't take up the full 10 to 15 minutes, but because I think Zen's given a particularly helpful introduction. But just to kind of tie a few of the comments together, what we've started with in this report is a reminder of what commissions of inquiry actually are. Because as Zen said, we're a country of commissions. And I think that when we're assessing the strengths and weaknesses and outcomes going forward of the Zondo Commission, we need to bear all of this in mind. So 2 of the things we've picked out are, firstly, the fact that a commission is limited to its very particular mandate, and secondly, that the commission is only empowered to make recommendations. And what we're saying is that both of those are quite politically nuanced processes, whether we want them to be or not. It's a commission of inquiry is not necessarily a forum that offers legal certainty. And we were never ever going to get a full answer to the extent of state capture that Nikki was outlining through a commission of inquiry. And I think it's important to keep that in mind when we're assessing particularly how much accountability the State Capture Commission can offer us. So starting with the mandate, we know that the mandate for the State Capture Commission was quite limited. You know, it really only looked at the period in which President Zuma was in power. And that's something that one can take issue with, because if we're really talking about state capture, I think it's important to recognize that the first colony in the area that we now call South Africa was founded not by a state, but by a company. So right from the beginning, we were captured when we imagined South Africa as a political entity by a corporation. So we really could have started an inquiry into state capture then. So that's just one example of how the mandate that's provided to the Commission can both be very political and quite limiting. And I think that we need to recognize that. I don't think any of us thinks that state capture only started in democratic South Africa in 2009. You know, we have always been, to an extent, captured by corporations. So we need to look at the mandate and assess the work and the outcomes of the Commission in relation to that necessarily limited mandate. But we also need to consider that the limitation of the mandate is a political decision. You know, whatever came out of what the Public Protector said in her report, the establishment of the State Capture Commission in terms of its mandate is a political decision. It's a decision that was necessarily taken by those in political power at the time. And the work and the outcomes of the Commission of Inquiry flow from that mandate. And then likewise, when we look at the recommendations made by the Commission, the acting on and outcomes of those recommendations in a real sense, and largely we look at that in terms of the MPA's prosecutions or delay in prosecutions or lack of prosecutions. These are also political decisions. So this is not a necessary legal outcome. It's a decision taken by, again, those in political power, which happen to be the same people who were in political power when the mandate of the Commission was established. It's their role to take those recommendations and act on them, but the manner in which they do so is at their discretion. That's still legally a contested question, but at least politically we can acknowledge that. And so it's just kind of a framing introduction to remind us that this state capture was never going to, the State Capture Commission was never going to solve all of South Africa's problems. And we can't have expected it to, and we can't judge it as against a standard that it was never going to be able to meet. So when we're assessing it both in the report and going forward, because we are expecting responses to the State Capture Commission's recommendations to hopefully continue, we need to bear that both in mind, both that the framing of its mandate and the actual performance on its recommendations are subject to those in political power at the time of each. So that was the provocation I wanted to offer.
Oh, there we go. Morning again, everyone. So I also won't take much of the 10 minutes, but I just wanted to know two very important things, one around Parliament in particular, and then on public procurement. Perhaps I'll start with the public procurement one. As we might all be aware, in terms of the last year in particular, we've had some inputs that have been made by members of civil society and the public in general around the public procurement bill, which was finally tabled before Parliament after, I think, almost 10 years, if I'm not mistaken. And one of the things that became quite obvious during that process in the National Assembly last year in particular was the fact that in terms of the President's response, they felt that a lot of the issues that were identified by the Zondo Commission were being dealt with in the public procurement bill. But when we subsequently went through the bill, we found that there were still some big gaps, in particular around transparency and accountability. So again, some of the big gaps that we have identified as civil society really relate to the fact that there is quite a lot of power that's being put on the Minister of Finance in particular in that bill. And we've seen it again in this version of the bill, which is currently before the NCOP. And what was quite interesting in the National Assembly process in particular was how fast that process went. I mean, everything kind of happened in a very short period of time. And we as members of civil society were actually quite worried in terms of our ability to meaningfully participate. Because at some point there was a new chapter that was introduced towards the end of the NA process, which we as members of civil society really only got a hold of the night before. I remember it was sent the night before, and we had to kind of engage on it the following late morning, early afternoon. And so there are questions around, you know, whether we've actually been able to really make sure that our voices have been heard in that regard. And one of the worrying things that we also observed was the fact that when National Treasury actually came before the relevant portfolio committee on finance, we then found that they had let us know that they received, I think it was 112 submissions on the public procurement bill, but they hadn't really incorporated or gone through all of those 112 submissions, which was a cause for concern, right? Because how are you able to meaningfully say that members of the public have contributed to this bill and they have influenced and shaped the bill to some extent if you haven't gone through all of the submissions? And it's one thing that we as the CSWG need to keep our eye out on. We saw it with other key pieces of legislation as well that were put through Parliament or before Parliament quite quickly with very short time frames, to be quite honest. And this is being done towards the end of Parliament's term, the 6th Parliament's term. We now need to think, I think as the CSWG, around how we can actually influence Parliament and those portfolio committees in Parliament going into the 7th Parliament in particular. Because otherwise we might find that we are in the same position that we were in this 6th Parliament in particular. There was a research report that was released by PMG, both in 2022 and 2023, and they had spoken about some low-hanging fruit. And one of their recommendations was the fact that civil society has an important role to play, and that portfolio committees and other committees in Parliament actually should be engaging with civil society a bit more around some of the concerns that they've identified. And I think going forward, it might be important for us to engage with the relevant committees here based on some of our recommendations in this joint civil society response that we have written. And just to note also on the procurement bill that currently one of the things that has come up repeatedly is the fact that it seems like almost everyone wants incentivized whistleblowing. We've heard it from the labor movements, we've heard it from civil society organizations and members of the public, and we've heard of the benefits, at least in preventing corruption, at least in exposing corruption, and incentivizing the whistleblowers who very much put themselves on the line to expose corruption. But again, the sense is that that might not happen because there is a process underway with the Department of Justice. And one of the things that we've been saying as civil society working group members here who've engaged on the process is that the public procurement bill should actually be speaking to incentivized whistleblowing as well for a wide variety of reasons. And again, that's something that I think we as CSWG can continue to make a noise about because it is a low-hanging but very important fruit. In the NCOP process about 2 weeks ago, the labor movements and civil society, the majority, had said, let's take this back to NEDLAC for further engagement again, and perhaps let's go into detail around the incentivized whistleblowing. So there is a pushback from, I think, members of civil society and others around this, but it remains to be seen if that's actually going to come up again going forward. I've also noted the issues around, I guess, the appointments indirectly earlier on. The minister has the power to appoint members of the tribunal, and one of the things that we've said as civil societies, you know, there should be consideration around having an appointment committee of some sort with different people who'd actually be the ones appointing and not just the minister themselves. One of the things that we need to watch out for is the meaningful public participation element as well, which I've also noted. And then on Parliament, I think that it's quite important to note that there were quite a few recommendations that were made by the Zondo Commission for Parliament. And those have been quite slow, I would say. And I've been thinking about it, and I think that there is an opportunity for us to maybe think about perhaps asking to meet with MPs, asking to meet maybe even with the Speaker of the 7th Parliament around some of our, you know, considerations as the civil society working group, because again, there are very systematic and institutional challenges that we have noted with Parliament in particular, specifically around their inability to hold the executive to account. What often happens in Parliament is that the different members of the executive will come before Parliament, and MPs don't necessarily challenge some of the things that are being said. They don't interrogate it in detail. Sometimes it looks like MPs are not as fully prepared as they should be to thoroughly interrogate what's put before them. And so I think that there needs to be greater emphasis by us as the CSWG around that. We also need to think about, you know, the tracker system recommendation, which I think parliamentarians really need to incorporate quite a lot, so that they're able to follow up on some of the processes that are underway, some of the suggestions that have been made when they've engaged with the executive. I still think that we need to perhaps discuss, so this election we're going to have the independent candidates, and we need to think in terms of our strategy as civil society. Is that an opportune moment for us to engage with those independent candidates as well around some of our concerns, perhaps doing things a little bit differently from what we've normally done as civil society? And then I think that, I'm just going through my notes, sorry. Yeah, so perhaps just to put it out into the room, maybe for us to talk about later on, what can we actually do differently going forward in terms of our engagements with the MPs, because I think they are very much aware of the systematic concerns that we have and challenges that they have as well. And it might be good for us, while we're thinking of that, to also consider the fact that I know Parliament has asked, like many of the entities have asked, for more money from government. And I think we need to strategically think about how we can assist them, because they're stretched quite thin. And so if there are some very big recommendations that we can make to them to assist them in doing their work, I think we need to do that and build some kind of relationship, a way of filtering through information at least. And just to put it out there, I mean, the entities like the AGSA, whom I know are very keen to work with civil society, or at least to hear us out, and perhaps we can also talk a bit later on around whether we should be reaching out to them with our findings and recommendations as well. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Morning. I will use my 10 minutes. I have a lot of things to say as usual. There's sort of two broad points that I want to make. The first being that a commission is a tool in a broader toolbox. It cannot be the sort of beginning and the end of what we do, but it can be incredibly useful depending on how we interact with and use commissions and their processes and their outcomes. I worked for the State Capture Commission. I worked for Nikki, actually. And what I want to remind us of is that a commission of inquiry, whether it's as big as the Zondo Commission or something a bit smaller, as they usually are, they are living, complex entities in themselves. They are entities that spring into existence overnight. They have no established structures, ways of working, rules and systems. They sort of make it up as they go along, and very often that's dependent on the sort of management skills of whoever gets appointed to head that commission. And as a result, and I must disagree, I don't think that the mandate of the commission was too limited. I think it was too broad. The commission had an incredible amount of discretion as to what it could investigate and what it should investigate. And I think that was a mistake. Because the commission tried to do too many things at once. And you know, I was there from the beginning. I can tell you that pretty much everything that anyone says the commission should have investigated was on the list. And it never happened. It could never have happened. But as a result, I think the results of the commission are incredibly uneven. Some things were given a lot of attention and depth, and the recommendations were really well thought through, carefully examined. Other things were sort of rushed, given very few resources. Very often there were entire investigations that were just shelved because there was never the time for hearings and things like that. And you can see in the recommendations that, you know, if one area is given careful thought to institutional reforms and others are given like 2 things, which is like, you know, investigate this person. And I think that unevenness, it's a big problem because it makes it difficult for us to sort of engage with the totality of the work that the commission has done. So as much as I do support the work of, for example, tracking the recommendations of the commission, I would also urge us to keep looking at the body of evidence as a whole, what the patterns and systems that were established can tell us, and how we might target our own recommendations that the commission may have missed, or you know, may have taken a wrong approach to sort of address that body of evidence as a whole. And you know, it is a point that you know, we made in our contribution to this report, which is that we really do need to be looking at the machinery of the state. And this is my second broad point, which is that the purpose of a system is what it does, not what it claims to do. And of all of the broad institutional problems that were either identified by the commission or have sort of emerged from the work of the commission, a lot of them the government has purported to address through this new raft of legislation. So there's the procurement bill, there's a whole bunch of new bills concerning the public administration, there's the SOE, you know, there's a whole lot of additional things. But very few of them are targeting the sort of mechanisms of state capture that were actually exposed so clearly through the work of the commission and through the work of organizations in this room. And I find very often when we talk about these things, we fall a little bit into the trap of thinking about a policy implementation gap, which is that, you know, the policies might be good, but our implementation is flawed, or the structure of the system is good, but we're appointing the wrong people. And I think I would urge us all to just look a bit more closely into the boring parts of the machinery of government, how institutions are run, how the public administration works, how SOEs work, because I find that that is where the fault lines really are, and it's in those little parts of the bills that are coming through now in Parliament. And mostly it's what's not covered in those bills that are coming through Parliament that I think is where actually the rubber is going to hit the road and the fault lines in these systems are going to be exposed. So I agree wholeheartedly with what Let's say that I think Parliament is a key target for civil society going forward. We did some research last year, very in-depth research, talking to parliamentarians and parliamentary staffers about their experiences with the oversight system. And an MP that really wants to do the right thing, or a committee secretary that really wants to do the right thing, or a committee researcher that's really committed, they can make some things happen if they are adequately supported. And I think it is really important for us to start forging those relationships and to support them as best that they can. I mean, their research division is relied upon by every single committee, and it's incredibly under-resourced. So, you know, when you do your research reports, you know, try and send them to the committees, try and, you know, get them in front of somebody and try and create those relationships. I think very often it sort of feels like shouting into the void, but like when you find someone that like wants to do the work, I think you can make a big difference for them. When I was at the commission, all of the reports that we got from civil society, including the Civil Society Working Group, even if they never received a formal response, inside the institution they are incredibly useful because you are constantly trying to, there's conflict, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but there's always competing priorities, competing opinions and interests, and when you're trying to push for a certain thing to happen, you know, those civil society reports are actually incredibly useful, and they do assist people in making their case and trying to advocate for specific things to happen. So even if you don't see the results of them, I do believe that they can make a strong difference. So yeah, there's the procurement bill that I think we need to focus on, and it's not just the sort of integrity and transparency things, but the bill is silent about procurement methodologies and about the actual mechanisms of state contracting. And that's what I mean by the boring stuff and the nitty-gritty that's going to make a big difference. The other things to pay attention to, the appointments, the personnel management, so that's the PAMA and the PSA that are ongoing, as well as the SOE bill, which should be open for comment soon. There's GILAB and the NPA bill, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's a few more things coming up. And very often, even if it's a short submission, it increases the volume of actors that are sort of singing from the same hymn sheet and saying the same things, and I think that really does help people who are sort of at the coalface really trying to move things forward. The last thing that I want to say is about the archive of the Commission. We are researchers. I'm a historian by training. There's nothing more useful to a historian than a commission archive. It's incredible. And this commission has produced an amazing amount of work. So, you know, the commission is a tool, and one of the things that it can do is unlock a vast amount of information. And I think we need to sort of push a bit more strongly for movement on the archiving front. Just last week, I submitted a request to the Commission for one of the exhibits that is not available on the website, and I was told that there's a very long process that I have to go through because the Commission's not allowed to share information. The HRC is busy indexing all of the data, and I think that's a bit of a cop-out because there's a difference between a large amount of data that the Commission has gathered that does need to be indexed and catalogued and carefully archived, and the exhibits that form part of the record of the Commission, which should be available now and should be made public now. And I think that is one of the sort of small, low-hanging fruit things that we can try and do, because a lot of those exhibits have never been put online, but some of them have. Again, there's an inconsistency there, and it shouldn't be difficult for the Commission to do, and I don't see a good argument against it. And I think it would be incredibly useful to researchers and journalists of all different kinds. So I think that is one area that we can push for. And okay, I didn't use my full 10 minutes, but I am going to leave it there. Okay, thank you. Hello? Hello?
there we go. Thanks, thank you, Devi, and Ariella and Mutlatsi, and just to round us a little bit off from some of our inputs before we open it to all of us to have a conversation. I think just following on from what Ariella, Mutlatsi, and Devi and I have spoken to, just on the elements of the report, I think just a key headlines of the recommendations that this CSWG's puts forward in the report as important to track and to be watching, coming forth from all the civil society submissions made. I think, further investigations and prosecutions is one of the main ones. And it does speak to the question of information being made readily available, both the one that's in the archive, that is also important to feeding into investigations. I think that, as Devi had mentioned and Ariella Mutlatsi spoke to, there were a number of investigations that were ongoing in the Commission that didn't get time to, didn't get the airtime, but that information is there. And I think just leading on from that, that's one of our main recommendations. And I think to moving to the next one, the whistleblower protection, Mutlatsi particularly spoke to that as one of our big recommendations that we'll be tracking the progress of and the implementation of. I think it's come across in many responses following the Zondo Commission's recommendations from the presidency and the uptake of that, but we aren't actually seeing progress besides more conversation about whistleblower protection. I think that's something that's going to be important. And as Ariella Mutlatsi and Devi also spoke to, parliamentary oversight. I think the big question that the Commission put forward was, where was Parliament when all of this was happening? And I think when we're talking about where the buck stops and where the people's mandate is supposed to be protected and the executive is supposed to be held to account, it is in Parliament. And that's one of the key recommendations that we're putting forward and that we'll be tracking in terms of what is Parliament doing even now after the fact? What have been the movements beyond bills, which are processes that will be moving through Parliament in and of itself, to check itself and to be engaged in this work, I think is one of the recommendations that we speak to in the report that we'll be watching. And public procurement, I won't then go more into that, but because I think Mutlatsi covered that really well, and Devi as well. But that's the big thing we pushed. That was the locus, and as we mentioned in the report, of capture. When we're thinking about how and what was the important part, what it was, in public procurement. And to have the progress that we're having in that, which we speak to in the report as well, with the bill that's not really addressing the issues that, not really addressing the issues, and to have civil society making submissions to comment on that bill is a process we'll be tracking, and we speak to that in the report as well. And SOE governance is one of the other major recommendations that we say we put forward and we'll be tracking, especially when it comes to board appointments and delinquency directorships and how we hold SOE governance to account. And I think, as we're saying now, we have a strained fiscus, and a lot of our fiscus now is being continually drained by bailing out SOEs. So when we're talking about the cost of that, and we connect the dots in this report, we're saying that's why SOE governance is so important, and for us to be watching and to be keeping a watching brief on that. And I think one of the other recommendations that I'll touch on, I've left a few out, but yes, we could all read the report, is the criminal justice system. And I think that is one of the main areas in which, if we're talking, I think Nikki mentioned it as well in her presentation to us, is if our criminal justice system continually fails to hold the perpetrators to account, whether it's companies or individuals, we're continuing to show that the lived experience is that crime does pay, quite literally, as I think Nikki mentioned it here. And so when we're talking about the National Prosecuting Authority and where cases have gone and where cases have fallen apart, this is something that's important for us to be watching and to be putting pressure around what happens going forward. And I think the big question has been from the public, oh yes, you know, the Zondo Commission happened, and I think we do speak in this report about how the Zondo Commission did do well by being publicly accessible and to the public and to be able, which was important for us as a public, because it informed discourse around this conversation of state capture and corruption. But the big question has been, okay, now what? And there isn't really a question mark